Stories from Maine podcast will begin shortly.
Our Stories from Maine podcast begins right now.
This is the Stories from Maine podcast for November 1st of 2024.
Hello Maine, and welcome to our very first Stories from Maine podcast. On this inaugural episode we will learn the story of the 27th Maine Infantry of Volunteers, and the 867 Congressional Medals of Honor they received for their 9-month enlistment in the American Civil War. After the conclusion of this story, author and historian Lori-Suzanne Dell interviews Laura Jody, senior archivist of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, to discuss the 27th Maine and their amazing achievement. Then, in the second half of our podcast, you will hear the story of how Maine's pine tree flag came to be, and why it was replaced with our current state flag. After that story, Lori-Suzanne will return to discuss the upcoming election, where the voters of Maine will have a chance to replace the current flag with Maine's former pine tree flag. Then, we will hear the story of how America's first Thanksgiving is believed to have begun, right here, on the shores of Maine.
You can follow Stories from Maine on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Facebook at Stories from Maine. And you can get Lori-Suzanne Dell's book through booksellers everywhere and through Amazon.
And now, the story of the 27th Maine Infantry of Volunteers, and their 867 Congressional Medals of Honor.
On September 10th of 1862, in answer to President Abraham Lincoln's call for an additional 300,000 troops to serve a 9-month enlistment and defend the Union, a regiment of volunteers was raised in York County, Maine. This national conflict was referred to by some as the War of Southern Rebellion. We all know it today as the American Civil War. When these 1,000 men of York County arrived for basic military training in what is today South Portland, Maine, they felt as if they were about to embark on a great adventure. These York County farmers, fishermen, woodsmen, merchants, and laborers trained, drilled, and learned the military discipline that would now rule over their daily lives. By late October of 1862, just as morning temperatures were turning much colder, these men of the newly formed 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers began the long journey to Washington, where they would be charged with defending the nation's capital. When the 27th arrived in Washington just a few days later, they found a heavily defended city replete with infantry, artillery battalions, sharpshooters, and naval forces who patrolled the Potomac. For these Maine men of York County, the war thus far showed little signs of being bothersome. Lee and his army of Northern Virginia were just across the river in the south, which seemed 100 miles away. Once they finally arrived in the capital, what they discovered must have raised their hopes. The city of Washington, D.C. was resplendent with much color as red, white, and blue bunting was displayed from every window, every doorway, light poles, fences, and any place where ribbons or bunting could be affixed. Well-dressed men and beautifully dressed women twirling parasols in the warm fall sun all filled the streets and were busy going from one place to another. All of the uniformed soldiers and sailors each saluted as they passed superior officers or tipped their hats before passing the many women they encountered. Yet, all of this hoopla and decoration betrayed the 27th's true surroundings. Trenches were dug in all around the capital, fences with spears pointing outward, to prevent a rush of enemy troops, formed a ring on the periphery of the city, while walls of stone, dirt, and sand piled up as breastworks before the cannons. It was a strange sight to see all of the city's merriment surrounded by the implements of war. For the men of the 27th, this seat of our nation's government, seemed the perfect place to serve a 9-month enlistment. Theaters and public houses were open and dining halls were serving up a tremendous business. An off-duty soldier or sailor could really enjoy his enlistment in Washington. Much like all of the troops in all of the regiments guarding the Capitol, their days were filled with drilling, practicing the military art of formations, marching, saluting, shooting practice, and a lot of waiting. Waiting for new orders, waiting for something different to do, and waiting for an enemy to show themselves. Every day was filled with the same manner of duty, but each evening proved a social dream as men were granted leave to partake of Washington's busy nightlife. Music filled the night air as local musicians played in social settings, and their sounds filtered out onto the sidewalks. Street lamps were lit, while the illumination from the homes, hotels, restaurants, government buildings, and nearby encampments all provided a festive, well-lit and party-like atmosphere. Even the encampments of these regiments were seen as pleasant enough. These men would enjoy card playing, high-spirited discussion, arm wrestling, and even musical interludes, by which to entertain themselves. Though men were dying in the rancor of battle, just a few miles away, these men of the 27th had found a Garden of Eden, a heavenly place to serve their 9 months in the Army of the Potomac. But as the spring of 1863 brought a new flush of green to the fields and blooms to flower beds, all of that daytime boredom and evening exuberance was about to be challenged, and what would come for the 27th Maine Infantry of Volunteers would fill the pages of American history. By June of 1863, the 27th was preparing for a return home to Maine, as their 9-month stint in the Union Army was about to expire. But trouble was brewing, and United States Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, was asking the 9-month volunteers in the Maine regiments to remain longer than they had signed up to serve. Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were on the move, and had pierced northward into Pennsylvania. Stanton knew he needed to retain Union strength in the capital at Washington, and might need to siphon off many of the well-rested Capitol defenders to bolster the fighting troops who were shadowing Lee's army. A fight was coming, and like a pending hurricane, preparations were being planned. The Army of Northern Virginia had proved to be a formidable enemy, and despite a superior Union strength in many engagements, these Southern rebels still handed the Army of the Potomac astounding losses on the many fields of bloody battle. When the men of the 27th were asked to remain beyond their 9-month enlistments, approximately 300 agreed to remain in Washington, while nearly 700 Maine men of the regiment chose to return home. By July 1st of 1863, Confederate forces, blind to the fact the Army of the Potomac had been shadowing their every turn, clashed with Union troops at Gettysburg. It was soon obvious to military commanders on both sides of the conflict that each side was building up strength, and all were converging on Gettysburg. Many of the troops of the regiments guarding Washington were being routed to the field of action to bolster the Union Army, which was forming a 3-mile-long line of battle. The coming fight between these two behemoth armies was about to unleash Armageddon. While 2/3 of the 27th had already returned to Maine, over 300 who chose to remain prepared for a battle that might result in the fall of the United States should Lee's army defeat the Union at Gettysburg and then march upon Washington. For the next 3 days, the fighting at Gettysburg was unceasing. The clash between rebels and Yanks would become legendary.
We'll be right back with the continuation of our story.
Would you like to be a contributor to the Stories from Maine podcast? We are currently looking for segment personalities in a number of categories. If you would like to know more, or if you have an idea for your segment, send us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and tell us about your idea, or ask for our present list of wanted segment contributors. Remember, that's storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
And now, back to our program.
On the second day of battle, and while Maine's 27th stood guard over the American capital, Maine's 20th Regiment of Infantry Volunteers, bolstered by 120 men of the 2nd Maine Regiment and the 16th Maine Sharpshooters, clashed with Lee's forces on a small hill at the extreme left of the Union line at a place known as Little Round Top. For hours, the men of the 20th fought until their ammunition was exhausted as wave upon wave of Confederates charged the flank of the Union line. At times fighting hand-to-hand, at times being reformed into defending lines that seemed to rise and fall and bend and sway under the bloody and deadly mortal combat. Eventually, Maine's Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had played out all of his tactics as the men of the 20th found their ammunition had completely exhausted. But another wave of rebel attacks was about to challenge the Union Blue once more, and the fate of the Union Army was about to meet a crushing blow. On the extreme right, some 3 miles away, the extreme right of the Union line, the exact opposite of Chamberlain's left position, was commanded by Maine's General Oliver Otis Howard and his 11th Corps. But the defense of the right had collapsed under the crushing force of Lee's army. Should the Union left also be crushed, the fate of the Union Army of the Potomac would be overwhelmed and defeated. Should the 20th fail, it would be up to the 27th and the other capital defenders at Washington to defend the American Union in one last and final battle. Chamberlain knew the gamble, and he realized what was at stake. Yet, his men were exhausted, their ammunition was gone, and another wave of rebels were advancing upon them. That was when Chamberlain ordered his 20th Maine to affix bayonets and charge downhill headlong into the maelstrom of the oncoming rebels. This bayonet charge down Little Round Top surprised advancing rebels, many of whom dropped their rifles, swung about on their heels, and ran for their lives. When it was over, the 20th Maine stood tall and in full command of the field of battle. Chamberlain's boys from Maine took 400 Confederate prisoners, crushed Lee's plans to open a road to Washington, and saved the Union from certain defeat. Chamberlain's order of a bayonet charge even surprised his own superior officers. We'll be right back.
You can follow Stories from Maine on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Facebook at Stories from Maine. And you can get Lori-Suzanne Dell's book through booksellers everywhere and through Amazon.
We hope you are enjoying our Stories from Maine inaugural podcast. We plan to bring you many more, but we could use your help. If you are enjoying this podcast and want more episodes to air, let us know by liking, subscribing, and commenting. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and help us to gauge your interest so we may sculpt the content we record. Our next Stories from Maine podcast will air on December 1st, 2024. And now, the conclusion of our story.
When word reached Washington of the failure of Lee's army to crush the Union forces at Little Round Top, the 27th were able to breathe a slight sigh of relief. But the battle on the outskirts of Gettysburg wasn't yet over. On the 3rd day of July, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had reformulated his plan and designed an attack that would even astound his own commanders and troops alike. Lee knew he had crushed the right of the Union line, and he was positive that he had severely weakened the extreme left, despite the fact that his men were defeated there the day before. Lee was sure the Union commander, General George Meade, would bolster his weak flanks on each end of the defending line of battle. And Lee was certain that Meade would pull troops out of the center of the Union line in order to strengthen those embattled flanks. Lee called upon one of his top commanders, General George Pickett, to lead a massive 15,000-man force to charge the Union center, break the defending line, and crush Meade's Union forces. 150 cannon began the nonstop assault on the Union line, just as Pickett's charge marched over open land toward the Union center. When Pickett's troops approached the Union Blue, the cannonade ceased and the clash of Southern Gray and Union Blue began. Directly in this melee was the 20th Maine, who had been rewarded with a rest after their defending action at Little Round Top. These exhausted men of Maine were placed in reserve at the center, where it was thought to be a quiet and unthinkable place for attack. When the charge of the Union center was over, Lee's army had suffered an astonishing defeat. Lee's forces suffered more than 7,000 total casualties, with nearly 4,000 surviving rebels captured. The Battle of Gettysburg had finally ended. Lee's army was now retreating back into the South, and the tide of the war had changed. The Union had been defended, the capital at Washington was safe, and the men of the 27th, completely untested in battle, could now breathe easy. On July 4th, the very next day after the Battle of Gettysburg had been decided, the men of the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers were relieved of duty and marched out of Washington for a trip back home to Maine. All of the enlistments of the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers and their time in the Union Army was now over, and so you would think would also be the end of their story. When the war had finally concluded with the Confederate defeat and surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in April of 1865, the United States of America was scarred and completely changed. Finally, the Southern states who rebelled and seceded from the American Union were now being welcomed back into the fold. Slaves all across the United States were now free. Many cities and towns had been completely destroyed, and the toll of death was racked up in excess of an unbelievable 620,000 lives. When the dust settled, and while monuments were being erected in every town, city, and state, all dedicated to the lives lost in the battles that took place, many medals were being awarded. Most of these awards were given posthumously for exemplary service and feats of courage, daring, and leadership. For the next few decades, as reports and stories were reviewed, Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded. Approximately 1,522 Medals of Honor were awarded for service during the American Civil War. But the most ever awarded to one regiment would even surprise a grateful nation. When over 300 men of the 27th Maine agreed to remain in defense of Washington, despite their enlistments having expired, War Secretary Edwin Stanton promised to award the Medal of Honor to any man who remained in service beyond their expiration. But a clerical error failed to record the name of the men who remained in service. However, Stanton had made an agreement. Not able to accurately identify those who deserved the award that was promised, Stanton chose to leave it up to the 27th's former commanders to choose the recipients. So, Stanton sent 867 medals to the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers, which was, as Maine author and historian John J. Pullen called it, a shower of stars. But that isn't the end of this story. When we return, we will continue the conversation with the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, Senior Director of Archives, Laura Jody. Stay tuned.
We hope you are enjoying our Stories from Maine inaugural podcast. We plan to bring you many more, but we could use your help. If you are enjoying this podcast and want more episodes to air, let us know by liking, subscribing, and commenting. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and help us to gauge your interest so we may sculpt the content we record. Our next Stories from Maine podcast will air on December 1st, 2024. And now, back to our program.
Author and historian Lori-Suzanne Dell sat down recently with Laura Jody, Senior Director of Archives of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, to discuss the Medal of Honor and the 867 Medals of Honor bestowed upon the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers. Here now, Stories from Maine author and historian Lori-Suzanne Dell.
So the story of the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers was thoroughly explored by the late Brunswick historian and author John J. Pullen in his 1966 book, A Shower of Stars, which is still available today. If you don't have a copy and this is a topic you're interested in, I highly suggest this book. So let's go now to Laura Jody. She's the Senior Director of Archives in the Historical Collections and Museum, I think I got that right, at the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. So good morning or good afternoon, Laura, and can you please tell our listeners about the Congressional Medal of Honor Society and what your position entails?
Okay, well, the Congressional Medal of Honor Society was chartered by Congress in 1958. It's signed into law by President Eisenhower, so we're part of the federal code. It is a organization for the Medal of Honor recipients, the living ones. It was chartered to protect the legacy of the medal and the Medal of Honor recipients. And it was also chartered to carry that forward into the future. So that is really what I do. My job is to curate and preserve the history of the Medal of Honor and the recipients, all 3,500 plus of them. Today, there's only 60 living recipients. So we try to keep all the stories alive as best we can. And that's what we do.
So why exactly is the Medal of Honor awarded? What is the criteria for being a recipient of the medal?
Um, those who receive the Medal of Honor, it's a military medal. It's the highest award for valor in combat. It used to, in the past, it's been awarded for non-combat actions, but today it's only for combat. And you have to go above and beyond the call of duty. So it's something up and beyond sort of what would be expected of you as a member of the military.
Okay, and exactly how many of the medals of honor have been officially awarded? I know you mentioned the number, but
There have been 3,538 medals awarded to 3,519 individuals. So there have been 19 individuals who have received two.
who've received two.
Yes.
And I believe at least one of them is from Maine. He received, well, one of them, I guess it was a replacement, which was Joshua Chamberlain, and he received a replacement medal, which has been located, by the way. If you didn't know that, it was lost for the longest time, and so now we have both of those medals are being preserved here in Brunswick, Maine.
Right. Now that is a different situation. He still is considered a single recipient of the Medal of Honor because what happened is they redesigned the medal over time. And so, for instance, what Chamberlain got was his original medal. And then when they redesigned it, they sent him the new design. So he's still considered a single recipient of the Medal of Honor. So it gets really confusing. If you receive the medal for the Civil War, like Chamberlain did, you could potentially have 2 or 3 different versions of the medal, but they're still for the same act of valor.
How many of those awards of the Medal of Honor have been to Maine recipients, as best as you're able to tell?
Best as I'm able to tell, it's 93, 90. Okay. Best as I can tell, it's 93. And those are people who were either born in Maine or enlisted from this into the service from Maine or joined the service from Maine.
So, as our story has mentioned, and as historian John J. Pullen noted in his book, A Shower of Stars, 867 medals of honor were given to the leaders of the 27th Maine Regiment of Infantry Volunteers to be handed out to those who remained behind to defend our nation's capital in June and July of 1863. So, can you tell us what happened to the 27th Maine's 867 medals that were to be handed out? Did they stay with them? Were they returned? Can you tell us something about that?
There is this is one of the big question marks in Medal of Honor history is what precisely happened to all of them. Because no one really kept track of who stayed in DC and therefore was eligible for the medal under Stanton's decree. The medals were pretty much engraved to all the 27th Maine, enlistees. And so when they were sent to the leaders kind of had to stop and think, oh yeah, was John Smith there? Yeah, he stayed. And so then they gave him his medal. In some cases, those who were in the 27th Maine had already dispersed, right? We're almost talking about the end of their enlistment. They all went home. So some of them weren't tracked down. So I believe at one point, the story is anyway, that a large bunch of them were in a barn that belonged to one of the officers of the 27th Maine. And the farm or the barn went up in flames. So they were all burned up in the barn. Now, when they were recalled in 1916, technically all of those medals should have been returned to the government. They were not. And I know this because we have at least 2 of them in our historical collections here. So a lot of them are still with family members. If it's something that you received, think about the nostalgia behind it even. This is an award I got for something I did during the war. So a lot of them are still out in other museums with the families, with their descendants. And And then, of course, some of them have been destroyed or lost over the years as well.
So you say that about 2 of them were returned.
Well, 2 of them were donated here to the society for historical purposes. The family wanted somewhere safe where they would be preserved into posterity. And so they made the decision to bring them here. We do see that a lot, particularly when you're talking about Civil War situations, because you could have hundreds of descendants by that point. And so having one central place where family history is preserved and you know it's going to be taken care of, and family can come visit it if they want. It'll be shared with the nation. It's really a bonus to donating things to historical institutions.
So you had mentioned this group in 1916. A group gets together and decides to go over all of the Civil War Medal of Honors that were handed out. Tell us what happened with that group. Who was it that did this?
Congress looked back over the years of the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor started during the Civil War, and over the years, different regulations and statutes were put into place about the medal and how it should be handed out and handled, and at what, I guess, level of valor, it's not really the right term, deserved the Medal of Honor. Because during the Civil War, the Medal of Honor was the only medal we had for recognizing someone going above and beyond. And that it continued that way until the 20th century. So by 1916, we had all these different rules and regulations regarding the Medal of Honor. And the Congress said, okay, let's look back at all the awards of the medal that we've had since the Civil War and see if they all rise to this standard. So Congress told the Department of the Army to put together a panel. This panel was of 5 generals who got together in the winter of 1916 into 1917, and they looked at every single Medal of Honor action for the Civil War, or Civil War, Indian campaigns, Spanish-American War, all of them between the Civil War and the beginning of World War I. We weren't in World War I yet, but we were sort of heading that way. So anyway, the generals sat down and they assigned everybody, random numbers. And they looked at each case file. And so they got into it and they realized this story about the 27th Maine. And their reaction was essentially, we're grateful to these gentlemen, the ones who stayed, but since we don't know who stayed and who left, and this doesn't really raise to the level of above and beyond, which is kind of where they were trying to take the medal at the time. And so they recalled them all. They made a decision to recall all 800 plus in that group.
Right. Who was the last person in Maine that you're aware of to receive the Medal of Honor?
The last person from Maine to receive the Medal of Honor was from the battle that we had in Somalia. It's best known probably from the movie Black Hawk Down. His name was Gary Gordon. He was a Delta soldier, and he was part of the action actually portrayed in that film.
And so we know that these 867 medals were basically rescinded. Is that the proper terminology? So
Yes.
by this group, is there, once an award today has been given or bestowed upon a recipient, is there any condition under which it can be, again, rescinded?
As far as rescinding medals of honor go, there's a couple different ways of thought around it. Right now, there's currently a review of the medals that were presented for Wounded Knee. Those are currently under review. And I believe that it's been asked of Congress to recall those medals, revoke those medals. And basically, I believe what's happened is they've decided that actually falls under the executive branch because the president is the commander-in-chief. If you look at the pure statutes, it's a medal can only be recalled if a person's actions subsequent to their receiving the medal were dishonorable. So you're thinking like someone who goes AWOL, who deserts, that kind of situation. And the Navy's done some of that, where they've recalled medals from people who have deserted over the years. But those all date back to the 19th century, as far as I know. So it's been done before, obviously, with this review board in 1917. But as far as modern case points go, if they decide to recall these ones from Wounded Knee, that will be the first ones since then that have been rescinded.
So has there ever been, and if so, how many women who have won or who have received the the Medal of Honor?
There's only been one woman, Dr. Mary Walker, for service during the Civil War, and she received her medal in 1865. She was among the group that was revoked. So it wasn't just the 27th Maine that was revoked in 1917. There were a few others as well, and hers was one. They determined that since she was a civilian at the time, she was not eligible for the Medal of Honor. Well, in 1977, her medal was reinstated by President Johnson. And because it was determined that, yes, technically she was a civilian, but she held the rank of an officer, essentially, with her duties and her assignments. So they decided to reinstate her medal. So she's been reinstated.
Podcast. And I'm sure that people are going to say, "Hey, I'm really interested in this," but there's another question that we have to answer, and it's the one that began all this when I received an email from one of our people on Facebook saying, "Hey, you got this wrong. Stop calling it the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's not. It's the Medal of Honor." And I said, "Listen, I'm going to look into this. I'll find out for sure." So there's the question. Is it the Congressional Medal of Honor or is it the Medal of Honor?
The name that's preferred today in modern times is just Medal of Honor. It's a little confusing because again, I've always looked at things historically, and historically it has occasionally been called the Congressional Medal of Honor. So specifically during World War II is what it tended to be called, Congressional Medal of Honor, and during the Civil War, it was called that as well. But today, the preferred term is just Medal of Honor.
Okay, so then there's going to be a little bit more confusion. So why is it called the Congressional Medal of Honor Society?
Well, because the society has its starts during World War II, where it was called the Congressional Medal of Honor, typically in the media and the press. And then also we're chartered by Congress. So it's kind of like a twofold answer. Today we say, just to simplify it, it's because we have a congressional charter and it lets us, be distinguished from maybe other groups out there that are Medal of Honor.
Fantastic. I think we finally cleared that up. And so thanks to our viewer who emailed in asking that question, you now have the official answer. And so people are going to say, "Hey, I want to go down. I want to go see these medals. I want to go visit this museum and this archive." Or they may be researching their ancestor who they believe or had heard told, "Oh, yeah, he received the Medal of Honor," but they don't know much about it. So how can they contact you? How could they contact the society? How could they visit? How could they research? Why don't you tell our listeners how they can do all that?
Absolutely. We are located in a greater museum complex called Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum. And our new Medal of Honor Museum was just reopened at the end of May 2024. So we are located on the hangar deck of the USS Yorktown at Patriots Point. And it's just down outside of Charleston, South Carolina. So, come on out, check it out. You can also look at our website, which are the initials of our organization, cmohs.org. You can contact me through that website. You can contact any of the staff, really, and we'll help answer any questions anybody has. And really, our website's just fun to poke around on. If you want to know the truth, there's all sorts of factoids and lists and fun things to do on there.
And hopefully pretty soon you'll have the link to this podcast.
Absolutely.
So, which would be fantastic. Well, Laura, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully this will give our folks here in Maine and others, a really good bit of insight as to the Congressional Medal of Honor and how 867 medals could go out to one regiment. And I've got another question for you. Did that happen at any other time in Medal of Honor history where so many were handed out like that?
I'm going to say no. The closest is going to be during the Siege of Vicksburg. I believe it was 119 medals that were presented for those who participated in what they call the Volunteer Storming Party. But I'm going to say no. This is a significant number of medals to go out for one action.
Well, there you go, folks. So Maine is first in history once again. Laura Jody, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and I hope we can talk again sometime.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Take care. And I'm glad I could be here today.
Many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. Each month, our Stories from Maine podcasts will highlight new stories, interviews, and the current topics involving Maine's people, places, and events. From history to the arts, movies, music, technology, and so much more. Please join us again on December 2nd of 2024 for our next Stories from Maine podcast. Follow Stories from Maine today for daily posts and weekly articles at facebook.com/Stories from Maine.
Would you like to be a contributor to the Stories from Maine podcast? We are currently looking for segment personalities in a number of categories. If you would like to know more, or if you have an idea for your segment, send us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and tell us about your idea, or ask for our present list of wanted segment contributors. Remember, that's storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
Each year many Americans sit down to enjoy a festive meal on a truly American holiday called Thanksgiving. But did you know that this grand American holiday is believed to have begun right here in Maine? Here is another of our stories from Maine, and America's story of the first known Thanksgiving.
One of the most prolific of all American holidays had its genesis right here on the shores of Maine, more than 169 years before the United States became a country, and nearly 213 years before Maine won her statehood. On July 31st of 1607, over a dozen years before Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, two ships arrived at the mouth of the Kennebec River, filled with colonists from England who sought to settle in the New World. The two ships, the Gift of God and the Mary and John, made landfall at what is now known as Fort Popham in Phippsburg, Maine. Over 120 men and boys stepped onto the rocky coast of the North American continent and began to carve out a homestead on the seaside of the Maine wilderness. They swiftly elected a leader of the colony, and George Popham became their president. They began to set up a fortification of tall fence and built their cabin-like homes within the protective walls of the fort. They also began to harvest the necessary lumber to build a new ship by which to transport harvested natural resources of lumber, furs, and other natural commodities back to England. On their return, they would then bring back necessary supplies and new settlers to join the settlement at Fort George on the Popham shore. Local food supplies came from harvests of berries, roots, and local game, as well as the abundance of seafood caught right at the shore. Any supplies of salt, flours, and grains brought from England were used to preserve fish and meat and for baking of breads and the fermentation of meat. Mussels, clams, crab, lobster, and fish from the surrounding waters provided ample supplies of fresh seafood. Gardens, foraging, and hunting rounded out the dietary needs of these immigrant pilgrims. Years ago, these pioneers had made friends with local natives while the colonists built their new settlement. Nahandia and his wife Skidwaris both welcomed these English immigrant pioneers and began forming a friendship. Their advice and teaching allowed these pilgrims to better use the land and make better harvests from the sea. By November of that year, the colonist settlement had progressed well and was nearly ready to weather the settlers' first Maine winter. The ships, Gift of God and the Mary and John, were about to return to England, and nearly half of the colonists, who came only to build the settlement, were ready to return to England. These colonists had much to be thankful for, and they soon organized a feast by which to celebrate, to welcome their new friends, and to say goodbye to the old friends who were returning home to England. These Popham pilgrims also invited Nahandia and Skidwaris, and they also welcomed Nahandia's brother Cashabes and another native friend named Amonquin. Nearly 130 people in all gathered there on the Kennebec and partook of a feast of Thanksgiving. The special harvest of lobster, fish, berries, wild game, breads, and vegetables adorned the many handmade tables with the foods and drink of the feast. Many prayers and speeches were delivered, and special thanks were offered to all, with special reverence offered to God. By the next day, both the Gift of God and the Mary and John lifted anchor, set sail, and slowly slipped from sight as their journey back across the Atlantic was hastened by the approaching start of winter weather. The rest of the story is one of hard work, courage, and a struggle to survive a brutal New England winter. Sacrifice, sickness, and death was an endured hardship for these English colonists. And they were not alone, as other settlers in a more southern area on the Atlantic coast had also met with hardships in their own settlement at Jamestown in what would become Virginia. Yet, despite the harshness of the Maine winter, these settlers worked daily to cut firewood, to hunt and fish for fresh food, and they worked to build a new ship, a pinnace they called the Virginia.
Stay right where you are. We will be right back with the conclusion of our story.
Would you like to be a contributor to the Stories from Maine podcast? We are currently looking for segment personalities in a number of categories. If you would like to know more, or if you have an idea for your segment, send us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and tell us about your idea, or ask for our present list of wanted segment contributors. Remember, that's storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
We hope you are enjoying our Stories from Maine inaugural podcast. We plan to bring you many more, but we could use your help. If you are enjoying this podcast and want more episodes to air, let us know by liking, subscribing, and commenting. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and help us to gauge your interest so we may sculpt the content we record. Our next Stories from Maine podcast will air on December 1st, 2024.
You can follow Stories from Maine on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Facebook at Stories from Maine. And you can get Lori-Suzanne Dell's book through booksellers everywhere and through Amazon.
And now, the conclusion of our story.
By the spring of 1608, the colonists had suffered for nearly 6 months through a brutal Maine winter in a hastily erected fortress settlement on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Sadly, their leader, President George Popham, had died, leaving no recognized leader to steer the fledgling colony. The settlers had had enough. When the Mary and John returned from England with fresh supplies for the colony, the decision had already been made. The colonists would sail back to England on the Mary and John and on their own ship, the first Maine-made ship, the Virginia. By October of 1608, one last Thanksgiving was likely held in Phippsburg, as these colonists, seamen, and local natives all gathered one last time on the New England shore. Then, Nahandia and his family bid goodbye to the surviving Popham colony, as they all sailed back to England. Although their time at Popham was brief, their story lives on today as legendary firsts in New England lore, a first in early American history, and as reminders of who we Americans are today as we continue to celebrate our own day of Thanksgiving each year. In 1918, the New York Times newspaper issued an article where they declared that the first Thanksgiving was held at the Popham colony in 1607. Then, in 1985, President Ronald Reagan delivered a holiday declaration, a proclamation of Thanksgiving. In this official proclamation, President Reagan briefly described this first Thanksgiving celebration, this great genesis for our continued American holidays, which was first held on the shores of the Kennebec River at Phippsburg, Maine. Today, a recently built replica of the historic ship, Maine's own Virginia, the first ship ever built in North America, is on display in the City of Ships at Bath, Maine. This floating classroom was launched in 2022, and you can board this ship today to learn more about these first English colonists at Popham. And thus, right here on the rocky coast of Maine, was born a true American holiday and a true and legendary United States tradition, as well as one of the greatest of our Stories from Maine.
We here at Stories from Maine would like to hear your opinion of our very first podcast. Drop us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
We hope you are enjoying our Stories from Maine inaugural podcast. We plan to bring you many more, but we could use your help. If you are enjoying this podcast and want more episodes to air, let us know by liking, subscribing, and commenting. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and help us to gauge your interest so we may sculpt the content we record. Our next Stories from Maine podcast will air on December 1st, 2024.
Would you like to be a contributor to the Stories from Maine podcast? We are currently looking for segment personalities in a number of categories. If you would like to know more, or if you have an idea for your segment, send us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and tell us about your idea, or ask for our present list of wanted segment contributors. Remember, that's storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
And now, back to our program.
In just a few days, the voters of Maine will be asked to approve, or to reject, whether or not to change Maine's current state flag, from the one bearing the Maine state seal on a field of Union blue, or revert back to a flag that Maine used for nearly a decade, but stopped using 115 years ago. But, before you cast that ballot, before you pull that lever, fill in that circle, or check that box, and choose to either change or retain the state flag, listen first, as Oscar returns, to tell the story of how both of Maine's flags came to be.
On November 28th of 1901, a token of appreciation was announced as an honorarium for one man, and this symbol's importance would be realized in the creation of a Maine state flag. General John Tudor Richards was born in Gardiner, Maine, on July 23rd of 1841. Richards had served in the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry during the American Civil War, and he served in the Spanish-American War in 1898. General Richards also served as the 24th Adjutant General of Maine from 1897 to 1901. Before leaving his position, Richards designed what he envisioned as the official flag of Maine, a cream-colored background with a blue star in the corner and a green pine tree at the center. Richards also pushed for legislation to canonize his design under Maine state law. When Richards left the Adjutant General's post in 1901, his many friends in the legislature sent him off with a great token of appreciation by passing Richards' legislation and formalizing Maine's first official flag. These men then bestowed a gift of a belt buckle, studded with diamonds and replete with a gold pendant, of the new state flag. Richards' design harkened back to his days serving the state of Massachusetts. The design he created for Maine's flag was a variant of the Massachusetts Navy ensign, which had been in use since 1776 and was in wide use throughout New England prior to the War for American Independence. Since Maine's statehood in 1820, and long before the Civil War, the state provided banners, or state bunting, which carried the seal of the state in the center. By the time of the Civil War, Maine regiments carried silken state colors on which the seal of the state or federal insignia of the particular regiment was emblazoned against a blue background. After General Richards left the state in the fall of 1901, the pine tree flag failed to have a sponsor and did not become popular, and very few were ever made or displayed. By 1909, the sentiment of appreciation had long since faded, and Richards' pine tree design was replaced by our current and official flag of the state of Maine. The general feeling of a majority of Maine's veterans and citizens believed that the flag which served the Maine regiments during the Civil War and later the Spanish-American War should be the official flag of the state.
We'll be right back with the continuation of our story.
Would you like to be a contributor to the Stories from Maine podcast? We are currently looking for segment personalities in a number of categories. If you would like to know more, or if you have an idea for your segment, send us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com and tell us about your idea, or ask for our present list of wanted segment contributors. Remember, that's storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
We here at Stories from Maine hope you have enjoyed this podcast. Our next Stories from Maine podcast will air on December 1st of 2024. In the new year, our podcasts will feature commentary, listener-contributed segments, and much more. So, please like, subscribe, comment, and share our podcast. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And now, back to our program.
By September of 1909, Having heard the voice of Maine's people, the 74th Maine legislature had moved to make the old flag of Maine, which had previously been the official bunting of the Pine Tree State, Maine's new and official state flag. And the design of this new Maine flag was permanently set under law, with the original Maine state seal, which had been appointed by Maine's constitutional framers at the time of statehood, centered against a Union blue field. And thus, the new flag of the state, one newspaper wrote, is really the old flag. And the arrival of the new state flag was seen as a decided improvement. The Union blue of the traditional Maine flag honors the legacy of our forebears and the sacrifices made to save the Union and free the slaves. In 1866, by resolution, flags from the late rebellion were preserved and were later placed on display in the Central Hall of the State House, where the flags of Maine units serving in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War were added to the display. Today, the many flags of our Maine servicemen and women who have and continue to serve our nation and our state are still displayed in the Hall of Flags at the Maine State House in Augusta and at places such as the Maine Military Museum in South Portland. The pine tree flag, with a blue star in the upper corner and a buff background with a pine tree at its center, harkens back to the days of British rule when Maine was still a part of Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was a part of Great Britain. This pine tree symbol remains in use today in Maine Maritime Academy's ensign and has flown proudly as the Massachusetts Naval and Maritime flag since 1776. And the state flag of Massachusetts also displays a star in the upper corner of their current state standard. Today, our Dirigo flag flies high as the emblem of the state of Maine, as it has for the last 115 years. Together with yesteryear's pine tree standard, each are ensigns of Maine, both displayed with pride, and each proudly serving our great state as the most displayed and more patriotic of our stories from Maine.
Many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. Follow Stories from Maine today for daily posts and weekly articles at facebook.com/Stories from Maine. Join us again on December 1st of 2024 for our next Stories from Maine podcast. Thank you for listening.
The Stories from Maine books, articles, video, and podcast content are copyright 2024. The Stories from Maine logo is a registered trademark of Lori-Suzanne Dell. Reproduction or use of any portion of the Stories from Maine podcast, or any of the Stories from Maine content, is prohibited without permission. If you wish to use any of our content, just send us an email at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. And remember, Lori-Suzanne's books are available through any major book retailer or through Amazon. Please like, subscribe, comment and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine.